Anyway, let's get started and welcome. And we're going to talk about crusade today. Sometimes it's called holy war, and sometimes it's called preventive war. Take your pick. I think you'll see especially why it's called holy war. But it is one of the three options. In fact, that's where I wanted to start us today. By the way, I got a lot of slides. I'm sorry about that, but a lot of words today. But stop me if you want to and just say, hey, I want to ask a question, or I want to interrupt with a comment or something like that. But anyway, where we've been, where we're going, for each of the three views, the questions are how to deal with human depravity and define the relationship of the church and the state. To the state. That's really the issue for all three of these. So we looked at just war. Whoops, I'm going to go too fast here. Just war, evil is restrained by the coercive power of the state, which the church supports. So we talked about that last week. So the church supports what the state's doing. We did say that there's a chance for pulling back if you think that something is immoral. You have that option, but if you're a participant in that. But that's different than crusade, where evil is restrained, yet by a theocratic state that the church imposes. So the church is imposing a theocracy on the state, and so that would be the definition of we'll have more of a definition of crusade in a minute. Next week we're going to talk about pacifism, where evil is restrained by the state, to which the church submits when it's not contrary to conscience, but with which it does not collaborate when contrary to conscience. So does everybody over here can see okay over this thing? Okay. So pacifism, as we'll see next week, isn't against the state doing what the state does. It just says we're not going to participate, and we'll talk more about it next week, if it's against conscience, against Christian principles, things like that. So we'll get into that. But that's kind of a survey in a different way of what we've been doing. So what is the crusade? Crusade is a war waged to remedy a past or ongoing atrocity, to undo something that no one had the right to do in the first place, or to forestall an evil that has not yet occurred. That will become very significant as we think about what's going on right now. So it's preventive, right? So either some evil has taken place and we're trying to prevent it from getting worse, or we think something's going to take place, and so we're going to try to prevent it. To add to this, it can include wars motivated by a concern for an ethical principle such as freedom, equality, or the right to self-government. But it doesn't have to. It can just simply be motivated by considerations of human wisdom and about a deadly crippling first blow anticipated, some threatening behavior. So it doesn't have to be guided by great moral issues like freedom and all that kind of thing. It's just somebody's threatening you, and with human wisdom and practical considerations, you're going to stop that. And then a quote from Francis Bacon, who was an advocate of this: "There is no question but a just fear of an imminent danger, though no blow be given, is a lawful cause of war." I think that's a great, precise definition of crusade. Okay? That's it right there. So thank you, Francis Bacon. So, all right? We're good? That's the basic definition of it. All right? Why not go with just war pacifism, you crusade people? Well, as far as just war goes, defense against an unprovoked act of aggression is often too late. And just war criteria, we looked at them last week, said you have to meet all the just war criteria. It's difficult to apply in the course of a war. So, once you get going in war, to remember all those criteria,
Were there 9 things?
I didn't count them. I think there were 7 of them. So yeah. So and it included things like proportionality, things like that. And you kind of get lost in, well, maybe we should do a little bit more, and so whatever. That's what Crusade would argue this. And also, often too late. You've got a threat, and just war says it has to be defensive. If you wait for it to be attacked, maybe that's too late. So. Well, what about pacifism? Well, they would say pacifism is a cause of a greater evil than it pretends to cure. So, so pacifist is sitting there while aggression is happening, and maybe you're saying, well, we don't want to compromise our ethical views, our Christian views, or whatever. But what's worse is getting attacked and getting destroyed and that kind of thing. So that's the idea. So really quickly, that's how Crusade people would argue this. So some examples that we're going to talk about today to set right a past act would be the Islamic conquest of Palestine in the Middle Ages. Now, these aren't necessarily all good, but we're going to look at this example in the Middle Ages. That's one that we often think about as the Crusades. And then World War I. The argument is that World War II was considered a just war. It was an argument against aggression that had already taken place. But we're going to talk a little bit about World War I and why some people argue that was a crusade or preventive war. And then the Jewish land taking of Palestine in 1948 and a reconquest in the Six-Day Wars of 1967. So many consider that to be a crusade activity. So, right, not just defensive. They took the Palestine, and then had to retake it. So we're going to get back into these in a little bit here, but that's why we're going to look at history. So after 300 years of abstention from politics, the church assumed political tasks under Constantine. So we're going to talk about this next week. The church was primarily in a pacifistic position the first 300 years, wasn't participating in the state's wars and that kind of thing for the most part. And then Constantine, of course, converted 312, 313, and stopped the persecution of the church, actually privileged Christianity, and so Christianity and the state got like this. And so we became kind of locked into the state's wars and that kind of stuff. So, but the New Testament wasn't helpful. So the Christians borrowed from Judean, that is Old Testament, and classical sources, especially Stoicism, that is Hebrew and Greek sources with some Christian accommodations. So that's where we're getting the crusade mentality, right? From the Old Testament primarily, and from some philosophical sources that were ancient in the Greek world. And although we saw some Greek sources last time that were just war theory, but Stoicism, for instance, would have been more of a crusade mentality. And then some Christian accommodation. So, the Old Testament, what do we get? Well, there you go, Deuteronomy, Numbers, Joshua, Judges. Lots of good stuff there, right? So, go get them. In a holy war, Yahweh assures them of victory and is with them in battles, such as symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant, right? Was going into battle with them. That symbolizes God's presence in the wars. As narrated by, for instance, the Song of Deborah. And if you haven't read Judges 5 recently, take a look at that later, because that's the whole chapter. And it's a Song of Deborah celebrating, our conquests, so in the name of Yahweh. The battle is fought on God's behalf for a divine cause, which God commands. The power of God is seen in troops when weak and small are led by a God-fearing leader who speaks the words of the Lord, and the enemy has to be entirely destroyed and nothing retained. If you know some of the stories, for instance, the story of Achan, who kept a little bit of the loot, and then Israel's getting punished, and somebody said, "Who took the loot?" And so they find out it's Achan, so his whole family gets, destroyed. So, because you're not supposed to, leave anything. So it's harem, it's getting rid of everything. So, yeah. And so the weak, also, you're thinking of a David and Goliath type of a thing. So, yeah. So Israel engaged in a religious crusade against the Canaanites, for instance, to purify Israel of the abomination. There in Deuteronomy. That's just one big example and one that we're all familiar with when they go and take out the Canaanites. Joshua says this. It says in Joshua, he smote all the country of the hills and of the south and of the vale and of the springs and all their kings. He left none remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breathed, as the Lord God of Israel commanded. That's a great summary of the Old Testament view of crusade. So, yeah. Yay, Joshua. So, yeah. So, it reminds me of the time during spring break at Wheaton College when I was a student. No, there was a women's house that some of the women who didn't leave for spring break stayed in, and some guys decided to drive around it 7 times. So, and we all just sat there and watched it and do that. So anyway, waiting for it to fall down and Joshua taking over, Jericho. So anyway, anyway, sorry, my mind goes in different places when I'm looking at this stuff. So it was so funny. They just very slowly just went around 7 times. And then the 7th time, they blew the trumpets. So anyway. Oh, yeah, they did, yeah. So I was a freshman, dear, so yeah. No, wait a minute. Maybe I was after I was dating you. So yeah, so anyway. Well, besides the Old Testament warrant, the architects of the Christian crusade looked to the Maccabean revolt in the intertestamental period, which is celebrated at Hanukkah, right? So some of you know about that, the Maccabean revolt, trying to deal with the Seleucids. So we get the whole Hanukkah thing there. I remember, and when we were in the Holy Land, some of you have done this, go up to Masada, and climb up there. So again, all this crusade mentality is in the intertestamental period as well. But the New Testament wasn't helpful, though some texts have been misunderstood as wanting to say, hey, crusade is okay, go get them. So for instance, the New Testament not being helpful, well, the cleansing of the temple. And I got this off the web. This says, Jesus driving the merchants from the temple, circa 25 AD, colorized. So that's actually on the web, yeah. So if you go to the web with Jesus and guns or anything like that, just be warned. You're going to see all kinds, yeah. But I just thought this was hilarious. And of course, people misunderstand that because what Jesus went to do, he didn't have a gun. He had this little weaving of vines that he used as a whip. So he wasn't trying to hurt anybody. He was just, trying to get all those money changers out of there. And so, anyway, I thought, so that's been misunderstood and misused for this purpose. And then another example. I came not to bring peace, but a sword. And so I got this. A woman with Jesus beside her can face anything. Yeah. Anyway, that's in the web too. So, but when Jesus said that in the context, what he was saying was, families are going to be divided. There's a sword coming down in the midst of families. Some will follow me and some won't. So we just take that out of context and that's what you get. So anyway, and then one more example of misunderstanding in the New Testament, misusing it. Yahusha, and if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one, from Luke 22:36. So the context there is, of course, Garden of Gethsemane scene and all that, and the arrest of Jesus, and he's telling his disciples that, and then immediately in the context he tells, Peter chops up the head. And he puts the ear back, says, put your sword away, and then says, those who live by the sword die by the sword. So he's not advocating that we do violence, but just making a kind of a hyperbolic statement. But we take that and all this stuff is on the web, so just be forewarned. It's worse than that. So anyway, I showed you. So the New Testament wasn't much help for the crusade mentality, that's to say, except unless you misunderstand it. So let's go to the Middle Ages. Pope Urban II. What's that?
Why did Jesus say that? Go buy one. If he didn't.
I think it was just a time of well, there's different commentators that have different theories about that. But in the context, he obviously isn't telling them to use it to even offer self-defense of himself, because in the context he doesn't do that. So, yeah. Some argue when he sends out the 70, I think in one of the Gospels, he tells them to take a sword, and some people argue that the name for that sword in the Greek is something you would use to defend yourself against animals that might attack you. So, but I don't think that's what's going on there. So, yeah. So, yeah. Pope Urban II.
What was it, Luke
What?
22?
36. Yeah. Luke 22, 36. Yeah. But one has to contextualize it in the whole arrest of Jesus context. So, Pope Urban II calls for the First Crusade in 1095 to free the Middle East from pagan control, pleading for unity in the struggle. Some historians argue that one of the reasons Pope Urban called for the Crusades was Western groups were fighting each other. So he said, let's just stop that. Let's go get this enemy together. So that was, yeah, right. So see, yeah, diversion tactic, right? So yeah, so then he said, I'll promise forgiveness to anyone who does the fighting. So Pope Urban II, and that's the dude right there. I give a little statue that, yay, Pope Urban II. So yeah, here's one eyewitness account. And sorry, I got to stand in front of this to read it, but having overcome the pagans, our knights seized a great number of men and women, and they killed whom they wished, and whom they wished they let live. Soon the Crusaders ran through the city, seizing gold, silver, horses, mules, and houses full of all kinds of goods. And then rejoicing and weeping from extreme joy, our men went to worship at the sepulchre of our Savior Jesus, and thus fulfilled their pledge to him. So that's an eyewitness account of what happened. So it wasn't very nice, but anyway. And we're probably most familiar with the word crusade with what went on in the Middle Ages. So the atrocities were not always confined to the cause of defeating the Turks. If some of you know this history, it's really, well, it's not funny, it's sad, but the capture of Constantinople 1204. So, the Pope says, okay, to this group of folks, I'm going to send you out, go get the Turks. And on their way, they stopped by Constantinople and just razed it and then went home. So they got a little diverted from their task of going to the Holy Lands and delivering it from the Turks.
Specifically, the Pope was sending them to defend the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah,
So
exactly,
they
yeah.
went to
They literally went to the Byzantine Empire, yeah, exactly. So that's kind of, it's funny, but it's sad, at the same time. So they literally razed Constantinople. There's a lot of other things we could say about this, but just to finish this part of it, the liturgy was expanded to include the blessing of weapons and standards for fighting. New religious orders, such as the Knights Templars, were formed, and Muslims were seen as the enemies of God, forces of the Antichrist predicted in Revelation by some. So, yeah, which is similar, we'll talk about that, to what's going on right now. So, yeah. So we could say a lot more about the Middle Ages. Anybody want to say anything about it? But from your knowledge of this,
To that point of how Muslims were demonized throughout the Middle Ages, there's some really interesting, weird stuff that comes down through Christian tradition because of that. Like, I think a lot of people know the name Baphomet, referring to the demon. Like, Baphomet comes from this era as a corruption of Mahomet.
Muhammad, yeah.
That is not an ancient word. That is
Yeah.
one of these corruptions that comes from there. We also see that in Charlemagne, if anyone's read.
Oh, sure, yeah,
Charlemagne
Charlemagne,
stuff.
yeah.
There's very much this idea of, I'm trying to remember the Muslims worshiping Baphomet, which is there, and who are the other names that are in that? Termagant, and there's three demons, and so it becomes a whole thing in medieval literature as well.
So they were appropriating that for their, and revising it. Interesting. So, yeah. So, yeah, there was a lot. I mean, it's and by the way, I put the First Crusade in scare quotes because some history books say first, second, third, fourth. It was just crusade the whole time until we get to 1500 or so. Yeah. So I mean, they just weren't stopping. So yeah. So well, let's go to the Reformation. Woohoo! Not any better in some ways. The Reformed churches. By Reformed we mean. Okay, so let me back up. Luther had a two kingdoms theory. And so his idea was there's the state and there's the church. And if we're just talking about the church, then you forgive and you turn the other cheek. But it's permissible for a Christian to participate in the activities of the state, even to be an executioner, for instance, let alone go to war for the state. But he wanted to keep those kind of separate in that sense. For the individual Christian could participate in state activities. When you're in the church context, you live according to the, if you will, the ethic of Jesus. So he really doesn't fit the crusade mentality in that sense. Lutherans don't, Lutheran tradition. But when we get to Calvinists, the Reformed tradition, so the Reformed means the reformers of the reformer. So if Luther's the reformer, Calvin, for instance, didn't think he went far enough. So, we got to go farther. Well, for instance, we're going to look at Zwingli here. And Zwingli thought that, the Lutheran churches were Catholic, basically. I mean, they didn't get rid of all this stuff. So there's Zwingli. He's a scary guy. He saw the church as the new Israel of God, successor to the chosen people of the Old Covenant, and now set in the Zurich church for war against the Catholics. Yeah, so they're really, and so if you know this period of history too, like in Switzerland, for instance, you had the different cantons, some fighting on the Catholic side and some on the Protestant side, Reform side, so fighting each other. So, yeah. So he's into that big time. Hey, but we can't let Calvin off the hook. Calvinism became associated with the crusade as Calvin spoke of the church as the restored kingdom of God, setting about the work of erecting a holy commonwealth, a theocracy. Even Calvin. And for instance, even in one episode, we could think of like the Michael Servetus episode, where this he was a heretic, and he was wanted poster for him, both Catholics and Protestants. Well, he made the mistake of wandering through Geneva, and they executed him. He was a heretic. So the idea was you had a real theocracy here that would even get rid of heretics like that. So you're not talking about war in that case, but it really exemplifies the theocracy. To Calvin's credit, by the way, Calvin thought he should be beheaded instead of burned at the stake, because that would be quicker. But the magistrates in Geneva, the consistory in Geneva, I should say, decided, no, we should burn him. So they burned him. So, yeah. And it was a decision by the town council. So, yeah.
Dennis,
Yeah.
do you see a similarity between Wolf, the writer, in that book that we were just reading?
Repeat the question.
A similarity between Wolf, the writer, who wants to, I think, establish a holy commonwealth.
Yeah. I think so.
Isn't that kind of
Yeah.
the same ideas?
Yeah, I think.
He writes that way.
Well, I think I'll show you a little bit later. I think there's a resonance of that even now in our country. So yeah, in the U.S. Yeah. So yeah. But Wolf, yeah, huh?
The question.
Oh, yeah. What was it? The title of the book? Wolf
It's,
book.
Living Without.
Oh, Living Under. No. You mean Rodney Clapp's book?
Clapp's
I'm sorry, Rodney Clapp's book. Yeah. There is a book by Wolf that I was thinking of, but.
He talks about, isn't it Wolf the one?
Right, in one of the chapter on Christian nationalism and all that. So yeah. I think they're proponents of that. Yeah, and so Rodney Clapp, Living Out of Control, which is a great book. We discussed at the house, and some women are discussing it in a women's group too. He quotes that book at length in that chapter 5. Yeah. So, but Wolf will be one of several, and I'll show you something in a little bit here that I think makes the case. Oh yeah, they're knowledgeable historians and theologians of a sort. So yeah, so I have to be careful with that word, but anyway, in these contexts, but I'm kind of want to prize that a little bit myself. But anyway. So I should have thought of that myself. Oh, Cromwell, the Puritan Road. Let's go to England, So Anglican Church, is getting dashed by Cromwell in the Puritan Revolution, right? Yeah, it wasn't much better. The cause must be holy. The war fought under God with God's help. Crusaders to be godly and enemies ungodly. And the war prosecuted sparingly. Yeah, so if you know the history of England at this time, it was pretty bad. In fact, this is a quote from one of the folks in this whole thing. The saints received their commission from the great king, King of Kings, to have a two-edged sword in their hands to execute judgment upon the heathen and punishment upon the people, to bind their kings with chains and their nobles with fetters of iron, and to execute upon them judgment written. This honor have all the saints. Hence, then, we see what a type of holy writ lies upon our parliament and army to execute judgment upon the king and his wicked adherents. So, so taking over parliament, right?
Can you say a little bit more about the relationship between Puritanism and Anglicanism?
Well, the Puritans are coming out of this later, yeah, when it's coming out of it, yeah. So, did you want to elucidate on that? Yeah.
Just so people know where the Puritans lie on the Protestant spectrum.
Yeah. Well, and do you mean in terms of, going against the Anglican tradition? Because they didn't think, for instance, that the Anglican tradition was purified enough from Roman Catholicism. So they're trying to, again, push back on that in a way similar to people like Zwingli in a different context. Yeah. So they're pushing back on that. So this whole thing with the Puritan Revolution, yes, is trying to rid the English Church from any holdovers of Catholicism that it perceived. Yeah. So again, you can see it's a holy war. Yeah, it really is a holy war in that sense. Yeah. One more comment about this, too. The favorite crusading text was revived. Cursed be he that keepeth back his hand from shedding of blood. That was their favorite text. So, yeah. So, cursed be you if you don't. So, yeah. It's not just saying do it. Well, some more history here about Cromwell and the Puritan Revolution. This I found fascinating. I didn't know about this until I was researching all this stuff. So this is the Soldier's Pocket Bible from 1643 for the use of the army of Oliver Cromwell. And this is a quote from that. He's trying to justify war, given what Jesus teaches. Matthew 5:44, but I say unto you, love your enemies. Well, 2 Chronicles 19:2, wouldst thou help the wicked and love them that hate the Lord? Psalm 139, 21-22, do not hate them, O Lord, that hate thee. I hate them with an unfeigned hatred, as they were mine utter enemies. So the soldier must love his enemies as they are his enemies, and hate them as they are God's enemies. Right? So, yeah, he must love his enemies as they are his enemies, but hate them as they're God's enemies. So they're trying to justify in this book, this is right out of this book, how we can live according to Matthew 5:44 by adding these other verses in the way. So, yeah. So just let you get it. Because one of the questions you should have is, like we've already seen, it's the New Testament. It's hard to imply this for a crusade mentality. So especially if you take the Sermon on the Mount or, things like that. So this is the way to do it. So if you need some help, I didn't know about this pamphlet until I was researching this stuff. So yeah, and somebody must have a copy on eBay, I guess. But anyway, so for sale. I don't know. One man who talked with Cromwell concluded that there are great occasions in which some men are called to great services, in doing of which they are excused from the common rule of morality, as were the worthies of the Old Testament. So at least they were honest about it, So yeah, you don't have to worry about morality. So any thoughts? I mean, that's one way to circumvent Jesus a little bit. So. Yeah? Okay, scary stuff, I know. So let's go to World War I. I mentioned that some scholars think World War I was a crusade, not a just war. So this is from the Bishop of London. Kill Germans, to kill them not for the sake of killing, but to save the world. To kill the good as well as the bad, to kill the young men as well as the old, to kill those who have shown kindness to our wounded as well as those fiends who crucified the Canadian sergeant. I don't know what that was talking about, some incident that took place, I guess. As I have said 1,000 times, I look upon it as a war of purity. I look upon everyone who dies in it as a martyr. So that's the Bishop of London, so yeah. So puts to bed that World War I was defensive in that sense. And of course, then we got involved. And once because Wilson didn't want us to go into the war, he kept us out of the war at first. And then once he brought the U.S. into the war, American churchmen actually got behind the president portraying Jesus in khakis, sighting down a gun barrel. I tried to find that one specific one, but there are other ones of Jesus holding a gun, but not that one. Aimed at Germans who were the Huns, so that to kill them was to rid the world of a monster. So it wasn't just the Bishop of London. Apparently, it was our folks too on this side of the thing. So, and then this was all viewed as compatible with love, because their deaths would keep them from crime and transplant them to a better land. So when I was at Wheaton College teaching at Wheaton College, I was invited to be in a group of discussion about this stuff with ROTC folks too, because we had ROTC on campus. And there was literally one of the officers teaching ROTC who made this argument that sometimes it's not a bad thing to kill the enemy because it might send them on their way to. Because what I was arguing was, what if Christians are killing Christians in the war? And he said, well, that could be a good thing because then you're sending them on their way to be with Jesus in heaven. So, yeah. So there it is right there too. So yeah. So the Lord God of battles was rolling up to the gates of hosts of Armageddon to destroy the great beast of the abyss, that the New Jerusalem might descend from the sky. Roland Bainton. He's the author of that book I showed you last week, The Attitudes Towards War in the Christian History. Roland Bainton from Yale University.
It looks like that's almost two justifications in that last paragraph. One is
These two?
sending individuals,
Yeah.
and the other one is hastening
Oh,
the coming of the New Jerusalem.
yeah.
So there's a kind of going up, if you will, of individuals and a coming down.
That's a good point. Yeah,
I think
that's a good point.
I think that also is relevant to some stuff that's flying around now.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, we'll get to that, but I think you're right on that one, and that's a good observation. So, but to argue that that's done within in love. So, remember the just war theory too. Last week we said that love has to be the commanding virtue in that too. They just would express it a little differently than expressing it this way. So, now here we go, and Pig hates us. Because I think that's where we're at, all right? So I'm quoting him. This is a quote. Having just returned from Dover last night, our troops and their families and the enormous sacrifice that they make is certainly heavy on my mind. So I'll close with scripture, drawing strength from Psalm 144. This is how the psalm starts. Blessed be the Lord, my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. He is my loving God and my fortress, my stronghold and my deliverer, my shield in whom I take refuge, who subdues peoples under me. And then he prayed, may the Lord grant unyielding strength and refuge to our warriors, unbreakable protection to them in the homeland, and total victory over those who seek to harm them. Amen. So, and if you've been following his quotes, total victory means I have other quotes from him. He said, show them no mercy. So we looked at the just war tradition, and the just war tradition insists upon mercy for the vanquished, right? And proportionality and so forth. This is total, so yeah. And to add one more thing to this, he has a tattoo on his right bicep that in Latin says, God wills it. Yeah. So pretty much so getting back to the ideas of, if you guys have been following this, there are some Christians in the military, and there are some other clergymen and others who are arguing that what's going on in Iran right now is hastening the return of Christ and Armageddon. So that's literally out there right now. So there's some Christian advocates of this war applauding it because it'll hasten the return of Christ and that we're on the verge of Armageddon. So.
It was also during the first Trump term. I'm trying to remember who it was, but there was someone that posted on social media that was in that circle. They had an assault rifle that was all decked out to look like Crusaders armor.
Oh,
and
yeah.
there was a whole media thing that happened. I'm trying to remember who that was when that happened, but
yeah.
it's been a running theme.
Yeah, so the crusade mentality is what we're doing now. I think you could argue World War II, we were using a just war mentality in that war, and it's been the ethos of the United States for a long time. until the last few wars, so yeah. So
Isn't something similar happening with Russia right now? Because I remember seeing something about how the Eastern Orthodox, like the heads of the Eastern Orthodox, were blessing Russian rifles as they're going against.
oh yeah, they've been doing that since the invasion of Ukraine. Yeah, they've been doing that. You're right. You're exactly right. Yeah. So it's not just the U.S. And Steve knows about. It's also a mentality amongst the Muslims too.
Shia Muslims have their theology.
Shia Muslims, yeah.
Shia Muslims have a whole apocalyptic theology that is actually the sort of the reverse of ours, which is they're bringing the apocalypse, and they have what's called the 12th Mahdi, who's going to be brought in to oppose sort of an antichrist-type figure,
Yeah.
who now is to them Trump. So it's both sides are using a crusader
Yeah.
mentality, actually.
Yeah.
It's a whole sort of mirror of that apocalyptic theology that is bringing in the apocalypse from quote unquote our side.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you can see that with the Left Behind movie. If you watched the first one, the second one was a remake with what's his name, the movie star. But anyway, but the first, if you look at if you can rent it, I don't know. So I have it on DVD. I should have brought it. We could have watched it. So the Left Behind movie played into this I mean, it would match this whole thing almost perfectly. Yeah. So anyway, Judith.
I just have a quick question. When do you think in our country this transition from rules of engagement, because I come from a military family.
Yeah.
My dad was in the military all his adult life.
Yeah.
He never had another job. And they're very cautious. The militaries go by rules.
Have been.
I mean, yeah, just try driving fast
Yeah.
on the Air Force Base.
Yeah.
Going 16 miles an hour to 15 miles an hour.
I know.
They pull you over. I mean, they
I've
follow
seen
the
those.
rules.
Yeah.
Or 10 miles an hour, but they follow the rules.
Yeah. The speed limit sign doesn't just have the speed limit. It says, and that means you, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And
I've seen
they're
those.
really slow
Yeah.
to violence.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So when did we go from kind of that, which is what I saw in my
Yeah.
family and all the Air Force bases
Yeah.
in the world we lived on, to this, which agreed with rules of engagement and rules to this lethality.
Well, lethality has
So
been
lethality
used
with
by, in fact, he said
no rules.
lethality instead of legality. That's Hegseth quote. Yeah, and forget these international rules. And last week we talked about the just war tradition actually being seen in the Geneva Conventions. So they actually articulate the just war theory. So that's, well, I don't know. We probably have different opinions here, but it seems to me World War II was the best example of that. And then, we got away from that on both sides in the Vietnam War, perhaps. I don't know if you could.
But don't you think there's some people in the service, lifelong or whatever, who still hold to this ethos,
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
even
Yeah.
though they're hearing different?
Yeah, yeah,
What? I'm sorry.
There's guardrails up for a lot of
Yeah.
the people who are more professional.
excuse
I
me.
think a lot of the commanding officers,
Right.
are
This is
like
their
that.
ethos, yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is their ethics, and they're older. I mean, they're not 20, 30-year-olds. These are older men that have been there for 30,
Yeah.
40 years.
But they're
And they
directing
sit
the
straight.
troops.
They don't, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think they still have that.
Yeah, and by the way, I just want to remind everybody, I'm not trying to be partisan. I'm just trying to, we're going to criticize all three views. So, yes, I mean, there's going to be lots of people that would still hold to a just war mentality, and in both the just war view that we saw last week, we made a point of this. We also will make a point of it with the crusade mentality that there are, and I think it's the next slide. If there's an exception where you're commanded to do something immoral, you don't have to follow that. So,
I think, yeah, they've said that. I mean,
well, there was that
Mark Kelly said that.
Mark
but
Kelly and
it's
some
true
others.
In the military
Right.
rules that they can't order you to do something that's illegal.
Right, or that's against your conscience in that sense. Yeah. So yeah. I mean, it doesn't mean you might not be thrown in the the clinger for it. So yeah, Nick.
Something I expected maybe was an idea that one of these would result in less human suffering in the aggregate.
Yeah.
Is that a component of any of these?
That's a component of the just war tradition in terms of proportionality. Crusade doesn't worry about proportionality historically. And when we get to pacifism, one of the critiques of pacifism is going to be that, and we've already hinted at it already from this perspective, that it might lead to a greater evil by not defending oneself against the enemy. So I would say the closest that comes to probably, I mean, this could be debated, but the closest that comes to the least lethality might be the just war tradition in terms of, in terms of that. So, yeah.
I think you do have to distinguish that even today, and it might not be true in the future, that the United States doesn't generally target civilians. It makes mistakes.
That's true.
I was a
Yeah.
Marine officer.
Yeah.
I understand rules of
Yeah.
engagement really well.
Yeah.
And the United States does not target civilians.
That's true.
It
Yeah.
may target civilian
Yeah.
infrastructure.
Yeah.
But as a rule, even today, we'll almost always just go after military
Not
and
in.
military adjacent.
Put it this way, not intentionally. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Mistakes will be made.
But mistakes will be made. Yeah. So as was made in Iran recently, and in My Lai in Vietnam.
July was
Yeah.
a war.
Yeah. What's that?
That was a war crime.
Well, it was a war crime, but my point is there are exceptions to the rule.
That was a rogue.
Yeah, there are exceptions. Exactly. That's my
He also got-
that's my point. It happens. It happens. But yeah.
Drummed into the military, you don't hurt civilians.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
That is something.
Yeah.
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 And there are defined at the tactical level very precise rules
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
about when you can do what you can do.
Yeah.
It's very,
So,
very precise.
in other words, I think what you're saying, Steve, too, is that it differs from some of the historical examples in the past that we've talked about, even the Old Testament.
Yes.
Yeah. So it
Sort of
would
like
not.
rape,
Yeah. Yeah.
pillage.
Yeah.
Can it happen
Yeah.
on an outlier basis? Absolutely.
Yeah.
It has.
Yeah.
But if it's caught generally, it's usually justice.
Yeah.
Court martials or whatever.
It's still a crusade. It's still a.
Goes south.
It's still a crusade in the sense that it could be a holy war or preventive, but not necessarily in the same thinking that has been in the past examples that I've given. The Middle Ages, even World War I, perhaps.
Yeah.
So
in
yeah,
that sense,
yeah,
The problem is that
Yeah.
weapons have become more destructive.
yeah. Oh yeah,
And therefore, the possibility for damage, collateral
Yeah.
damage become greater. It's not just swords anymore.
one of the
Up to
criticisms.
nuclear weapons.
Right. Well, one of the criticisms we saw last week with just war theory is it's many argue it can't be used with nuclear weapons. You can't meet the criteria with nuclear weapons. But even another source I was reading in preparation for the just war tradition was making the argument that not just nuclear weapons, but the lethality of modern weapons also calls into question whether we can follow those criteria adequately. Yeah. So yeah. So.
It gets even more complicated if you leave the decision up to a drone that's AI driven.
That's true. Yeah. Especially,
Program the AI to
Yeah.
respond to it.
well, and the sad thing is in some of those cases, some guy's sitting at a screen, right, and watching do that. So, I mean, there's talk about, with AI and everything, that there's less and less human involvement in actually the destruction. So, yeah. So, yeah. Great comment. Thank you for the comments, too. Two other remaining ideas, and one we've already hinted at. But the best way, the crusade mentality would argue, the best way of preventing war is to be well and fully armed, and unarmed neutrality may provoke attack. Just war tradition can also make that argument. When I was in graduate studies, I studied Karl Barth's view of war. Karl Barth was, as one person said, as close to a pacifist you could get without being one. But I mean, he was very late asking Britain and the United States to get into World War II. And it wasn't until the church was threatened and the gospel's purity was threatened that he called for them to get into the war. That's interesting. But after the war, many accused him of being naive because he argued against armament buildups. So from this perspective and the just war perspective, the argument would be we need to build up the arms. So interestingly enough, when I was in graduate studies at Princeton, and you guys may have encountered this, some of you older folks, nuclear freeze movement. During Reagan's administration, there was the nuclear freeze movement. And it was led by a lot of churchmen, a lot of Christians involved in it. And So I just was curious about it. So I went on the train that was went into New York City, and 750,000 people marched to Central Park for a nuclear freeze. The argument wasn't, we're not saying get rid of the nukes. We're just saying we have enough. Don't make any more. And during the Reagan administration, of course, he was trying to build up the nuclear arsenal. So that's kind of an interesting way of talking about armament. Maybe we have enough. So enough to, make the rubble bounce. So as one person put it. An individual citizen, this is also crusade mentality. An individual citizen is morally obligated to refuse to participate in individual acts he knows are morally wrong, but he can't be held responsible, says the crusader, for knowing that the war itself is wrong. Both consistent pacifism and unquestioning obedience to superiors are abdications of moral responsibility. So the crusader is arguing you can't be unconditionally pacifist in that sense, and at the same time, unquestioning obedience is wrong. But you're excused if you didn't know the war was wrong, and you're just following orders. Yeah, so that's the argument. So, in the material that I was reading. So those are two leftovers that we want to make sure you hear. Well, we've talked a little bit about some of these things, but let's talk about some critical reflections. So see if this helps us think this. And again, we're doing this with all three views, so nobody gets a pass, all right? So the first one is, I was saying, can crusade or holy war be justified in the New Testament or the teachings of Jesus? So we've already kind of covered that. Anybody want to, would you all agree it's kind of hard to base it on the New Testament and Jesus' ethical teachings?
I would just say that there's a lot, you have to look really hard for like that passage that says something about it. Most of what Jesus taught was not crusade mentality.
Well, as a matter of fact, amongst his disciples, he had a zealot, but he also had a person who worked for, Matthew, who worked for the government, right? So,
he wanted them to find ways to get along with higher authority.
So I think it's hard in that sense. And that's why we looked at the fact that the Old Testament is really what gives a lot. Well, and you saw that with Pete Hegseth. He goes back to the Psalms, and if you've heard some of our other folks in the cabinet, they have used some quotes from the Old Testament for what they're doing. So yeah.
I wonder if crusade advocates would say that Jesus' non-resistance was because Rome would just outgun.
That's true. Yeah.
In other words, in the circumstances of the moment.
Yeah.
He's, and I'm not saying this is Jesus. I'm saying I wonder if someone critiquing Jesus' New Testament thoughts would say, look, he was smart enough to know that any rebellion against Rome would crush. Crushed, and therefore, in his context, he was even prophesied.
He was prudent.
Yeah, he was prudent.
Yeah.
Another time and place where, if you will, the kingdom of God had armaments.
Yeah.
Then it would be a different scenario.
And
I wonder if they would argue it.
I've heard some argue that he was prudent in the sense that it would have diverted what he was really all about was getting to the cross. So some have argued that too. Yeah, in the same way.
From that perspective, would you argue the same thing when Paul is saying, submit to your authorities, and also, by the way, your authority is Nero, who's killing you guys?
Yeah.
It kind of could be the same argument of go fight if you're going to lose, but then his point was not to do that in the first place.
Yeah, and 1 Peter is even more strident than Romans 13, which actually is calling on Christians to, be subservient to this government that is actually might be persecuting you. So So in that sense, but Romans 13 is and I think maybe you're getting there, but we talked about that last week with Just War, that Just War theorists use Romans 13 to say that's the state's job, right, is to punish evil and lift up the good. So you should, be a part of that. I was just questioning it last week in the criticisms, that if you look at Romans 12, when it says, don't fight evil with evil and, that kind of thing. So, yeah. So another criticism we might put out here is, what about separation of church and state? Let the state be the state and the church be the church. what does it mean for the church to be a participant in the global fellowship of the kingdom of Christ? So if the church is part of the global fellowship of the kingdom of Christ, then can the church be the church if it participates in the state's crusade against an enemy that the state perceives as an enemy to the state? So that's, so you could argue that in kind of a two kingdoms theory of Luther, okay, state, fallen world, deal with these things in a worldly way. But the church is going to remain the church, right? And we're going to see a little bit of that argument with pacifism next week, where some pacifists will argue, all right, yeah, the state's going to do what the state's going to do, so yeah. Another one is judging the extent and imminency of the danger is often difficult. Judging it is difficult. There's always a danger of reacting too soon, yeah, and also waiting too long. The Crusades would argue, mentality, you don't want to wait too long. You might get plastered, by the enemy. But maybe you made a wrong judgment and you're getting in too soon and you shouldn't. Does that make sense? So, yeah, judgment is hard to call. Another one, the veil of national sovereignty can be used to redescribe terrible crimes and atrocities on both sides. So in the crusade mentality, we justify what we're doing, but it might be a way of also hiding some atrocities that we engage in and some things that were just not right. So that's, and we always have to justify what we're doing. So remember with just war theory, we said that it wasn't meant to justify war. It was meant to make sure that war is just. And that's a big difference. I think the crusade mentality would be more in the vein of we want to justify war. So does that make sense? And then someone else said, who's to say which religions and which ideals are allowed to act as crusaders or in preventive war in a pluralistic world? We live in a pluralistic world. By the way, there were just a couple of, and this is, as one Republican congressman said, this is just marginal. There were 3 examples recently of saying that Muslims have no right to be in our country. Well, we live in a pluralistic world where we have Islam arguing for its side, like Steve was saying, that, even with apocalyptic notions in Shia Islam. So if we're going to justify war from a Christian holy war perspective, some would argue that's no different than a Muslim, like a Shia Muslim, arguing holy war in that perspective. So who gets to decide which is right? So, huh? Which is more holy, yeah. So, yeah. So, I mean, we live in a pluralistic world where, again, we're going to justify the crusade. Then this is a big one that some are arguing against this view. So the crusade mentality is arguing a lesser evil principle. In other words, the lesser evil is to go ahead and wipe out the enemy and their ability to do whatever they were doing. And so you're going to do maybe even some collateral damage along the way, but the lesser evil principle. But it said it's an inadequate basis for moral decision. This principle is concerned with consequences. The lesser evil is what will end up being better. But justice is not primarily a matter of consequences. It also has to do with the treatment of human beings, the rights of persons, and the moral and legal obligations and limitations this places on government. And the fancy word here, if you're not familiar with it, this, in other words, it involves deontological, not just teleological. I'll come back to that. The Christian principle is justice tempered by love. So the argument here is that the crusade mentality is primarily thinking consequentially. How do we get rid of this threat to us? Deontology is talking about duty to moral principles. So we should be not just thinking about how can we rid the world of this threat, but if we're going to be thinking about this threat, how do we think about it in terms of we're going to be dealing with human beings who have a right to live? We're going to be dealing with principles of fairness, justice, as we said, justice tempered by love. So it's basically saying the crusade mentality isn't rich enough with virtue and moral categories, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Yeah.
We once say that, and I'm no student of history, if the World War II began with a just war framing, the nuclear ending was a crusade.
Mm-hmm.
It was a lesser evil principle. More people will be
Yeah.
killed in the long run,
Yeah.
even though a nuclear attack is not proportional.
That was exactly one of the rationale, right, for dropping the bombs. Yeah, yeah. So that more deaths would have occurred if we hadn't done that in the long run. Yeah. So
It was a lesser evil.
I think that's a good way to put it, Todd, that we entered into it with just war criteria. And some could argue that the way we ended it was not proportional. So it was a crusade attack, so to speak. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, last comment or?
First point, something that I always find very interesting about the crusade mentality is that, like, traditionally what we do as Christians is that Jesus is the definitive revelation of God.
Yes.
So we are constantly reading the Old Testament with this lens of Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus is a rabbi. Rabbis interpret Torah, and so we're constantly approaching stuff with the interpretive lens given to us by Jesus. And
Yeah.
I think through this, you've done a really good job at demonstrating that, like, people who are really in the crusade mindset, they do the opposite. They are constantly reinterpreting Jesus through the lens of stuff from the Old Testament in a way that feels like very counter-Christian.
Yeah.
I always think that is perhaps one of the most harshest critiques of this way of seeing
No, I agree with you. But also opens up a whole can of worms that we don't have time to get into, and a really good one. That is how to relate the Old Testament to the New Testament.
Right.
Because if Israel's interpreting Yahweh correctly, then Yahweh is telling them to do what they did, and then seems to change. God seems to change when we get to the New Testament, and so there are people that are trying to to figure that out, and it does require a lot of theological reasoning and biblical study and so forth to see if there's a transition there that occurred.
Saying there's not intense value in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
We get in the first century the Gnostic Christians who are like, let's just cut it all off.
Yeah,
and say that
that's right.
The Old Testament's
We don't want to get rid of it. Yeah,
and,
but there is some would argue that God changed the modus operandus as we get into the So it raises a whole issue that's really fascinating. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So one last comment, and then I gotta let you guys go.
Yeah, time, but I do think it's interesting because I remember when I was younger, we had seen the video about like how it was a different church. I was watching a video about how I guess some people in the U.S. government were unknowingly kind of fulfilling. I don't want to say fulfilling the time policy, but like the idea of like I think after 9/11, you had the World Trade Center.
Yeah.
You had people who were going to the Old Testament to the Scripture. I think it was like something from Isaiah. Like without knowing it sounds like on the surface like something like, oh, we'll get back and we'll be better. But the idea is like, if you read it in context, no, that's saying kind of end times theology. Like this is going to be happening near the end.
Yeah.
It's not something that you're supposed to take comfort in.
Yeah,
I find
well.
it very interesting that like there's a lot of emphasis like when people want to pull out some action towards like justifying some sort of action, they're like, we go to the Old Testament for that because you cannot find that in the New Testament.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And you're right. Some people almost unthinkingly are applying it to kind of a eschatological, thing going on there. So yeah, it's been happening lately too. So yeah. Hey, thanks you guys for. Yeah, Todd does a great job of ending us with these.
Dennis is preaching today too.
Yeah, and gluttony and lust too. So anyways, it's a big day for me. So.
This is a calling for civil authorities from the Book of Common Prayer. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send down on those who hold public office the spirit of wisdom, charity, and justice, that with steadfast purpose they may faithfully serve in their offices to promote the well-being of all people. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for that, Todd. Appreciate it. And next week, pacifism. So we'll get to the third option. All right. So, all right. Thanks, you guys. Appreciate it. So, thank you.